Football fans, I hope you enjoyed this series so far of the top 5 players in each NFL organization's history. Got a few more teams to get through. I'm in the ends now, so I'm not much closer to the end. Also, if you're football fans, make sure you check out my work on ProFootballSpot.com where I write about the Chicago Bears. My most recent article talking about how the Chicago Bears could be headed for disaster in 2014 is down in the description box below, so check it out and let me know what you think. All right, today I'm here to talk about the New Orleans Saints and the 5 greatest players in the history of the New Orleans Saints organization. And for many years, the New Orleans Saints were a bad organization. The New Orleans Saints were one of the laughingstock organizations in all of the NFL. If you've just come into football more recently, you might not think that today. You might view the New Orleans Saints as one of the more marquee attractive franchises in the NFL, if you will. But clearly, that was not always the case. New Orleans, where the fans with the bags over their heads became a trademark. They became known as the New Orleans Saints, and they earned that reputation for a long time. They earned it. Through their first 39 years in the team's history, they made the playoffs a total of 5 times. That didn't happen the first time until 20 plus years into their existence. So they've been the Aints for many years. They're not the Aints anymore. They are the New Orleans Saints. So let me talk about the 5 greatest players in the history of the Saints organization. Some honorable mentions, guys that didn't make the list. Guys like Marques Colston and Joe Horn, Deuce McAllister, Pat Swilling, Danny Abramowitz, going back to the original teams. A lot of you might know him more for his work as a special teams coordinator in the NFL over the years. Well, those are some of the guys that have been contributors to the Saints, good players in the history of the Saints organization, but didn't quite do enough to crack the top 5. Let's go into the top 5, though. Number 5, Archie Manning, who younger fans know more for his seed, Peyton and Eli. But Archie Manning was once a great prospect coming out of college, coming out of Ole Miss. He was the 2nd overall selection for the Saints in the 1971 NFL draft, and he was a guy that was going to be the franchise savior. The problem is that the Saints drafted so poorly for so many years, and Archie Manning was saddled and stuck on so many bad, horrendous Saints teams that in some ways you feel like his talent was wasted. He was a 2-time Pro Bowler, but for many years to me, he was really the only player you could sit there and say, you go to the New Orleans Saints, he was the one guy you would actually want to watch. He was like the one real professional player, if you will. And you look at some of his stats, they might not be all that impressive, what have you, but Archie Manning, like I said, was more of a victim of circumstance and situation than it was anything else. Imagine if he played in the modern NFL, where after his first 4 or 5 years, he could have maybe left via free agency and went to a team that was better run than the Aints were at that time. Imagine what the legacy of an Archie Manning could have been, but ultimately wasn't. But he's still viewed, I think, almost unanimously as one of the great players in Saints history, and he ends up at number 5 on my list. Number 4 is one of my favorite football players of all time, who sadly is no longer with us, and that is, of course, Sam Mills. What I love about Sam Mills so much was the fact that here was a guy coming out of college. He was too small, too short, too slow. He couldn't play middle linebacker at the NFL level. He goes to the USFL, and that was a great thing about the USFL. For some players, it gave them a chance and an opportunity to pursue a dream and go after it that they wouldn't have gotten just strictly from the NFL. And Mills made the most of that opportunity. When Jim Mora came to take over the Saints in the mid-'80s, he brought Sam Mills along with him. And over the course of the 9 years that Mills played in New Orleans from 86 to 94, these were some good times in relative comparison, especially to the history of the Saints before that, where they had brought in head coaches like Hank Stram, who couldn't turn it around, Bum Phillips, who couldn't turn it around. Here's Sam Mills, and he really, was a part of the rebirth of the New Orleans Aints into the New Orleans Saints as a credible, viable NFL franchise under the direction of Jim Mora. In particular, part of one of the greatest linebacking cores of all time, with fellows like Rickey Jackson and Pat Swilling. You throw Sam Mills into the mix, one of the better inside linebackers of his time, a 4-time Pro Bowler, but again, really a part to me of helping to change the perception of the Saints organization, which was a very big thing at the time. And I always felt he was really the leader and the heart and soul of those Jim Mora defenses of the late 80s and early 90s. Whereas he was the heart and soul and leader to me of those defenses, I think the best player on those defenses was Rickey Jackson, who comes in at number 3 on this list. He spent 13 years with the New Orleans Saints. He was the second overall selection out of Pittsburgh in the 1981 NFL Draft. During his time in New Orleans, he was a six-time Pro Bowler. He had 6 seasons of 10 or more sacks. He was one of the better outside pass rushers of his time. He really, to me, frankly, was the best Saints player throughout the decade of the 1980s, notably on some really good Saints teams of the late 80s and early 90s. Rickey Jackson was the best linebacker. He was the best defensive player, and he was the best football player on that team. A big part, again, similar to a Sam Mills and a Pat Swilling as well, to the rebirth of the Aints into the Saints as a credible, viable NFL franchise. Number 2, I will go with Willie Roaf, the 8th overall selection out of Louisiana Tech in the 1993 NFL Draft. During his 9 seasons in New Orleans, he was one of the better left tackles of his time. He was a 7-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time All-Pro, a member of the 1990s NFL All-Decade team, and similar to Rickey Jackson, has a place now in the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton. Willie Roaf was a really good football player and a really good offensive tackle who, if he would have played for more notable teams other than the Saints for the majority of his career and then the Chiefs at the tail end of it, he probably would get more recognition and be more well and highly thought of, because this was a guy who could do it all, in my opinion. He had great feet, he had good length, he had good leverage, he had good strength. He was equally effective, in my opinion, anyways, or pretty close to it, in terms of his pass protection and his run blocking. He was one of the best at it for a decade period of time, and to me is the second greatest player in the history of the New Orleans Saints. But let's be honest, it's all foreplay compared to number 1. We all know who number 1 is. That's Drew Brees. Yeah, the interesting thing about Drew Brees, this was a guy who was drafted in the second round by the Chargers in 2001. He struggled his first couple of years, didn't really get an opportunity, didn't really do much with any opportunity. Then he finally gets an opportunity 2004, 2005, except the fact is that, they didn't bring in Phillip Rivers, so now Brees has a bunch of pressure on him. He puts up 2 really good seasons in San Diego. Then he's allowed to leave via free agency. He has a shoulder injury, goes to Miami, fails the physical there, so Sean Payton brings him into New Orleans, and the rest is history. I talked about before with the New Orleans Saints that only 5 times in their first 39 years of existence did they make the playoffs. Well, in the 8 years that Drew Brees has played for the New Orleans Saints and quarterbacked the New Orleans Saints, they have made the playoffs 5 times. So 5 times in 39 years versus 5 times in 8 years. In my opinion, beyond question, I thought for many years it was Reggie White, and I thought in some ways it might always be Reggie White. I think Drew Brees is easily the greatest free agent signing in the history of NFL free agency, period. You're talking about one of the true elite quarterbacks in the National Football League. This is a well understood thing. I don't think anybody really disputes it. They might dispute the rankings of 1 to 4, but the 4 elite quarterbacks in today's NFL, most everybody can agree on, is Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Drew Brees, and Aaron Rodgers. And Brees is always mentioned in that group. It is an established certainty that he is a franchise NFL quarterback, and an elite one at that. A 7-time Pro Bowler. He's been a Pro Bowler every season but one since he came to New Orleans. He's a 1-time All-Pro. Like I said again, his impact, his significance, especially post-Katrina in 2005, where the Saints and the city of New Orleans were really scuffling and really, down in the dumps and really needed some hope, needed something to lift them up at least a little bit, provide a little bit of a vision of the future in a positive way, bring some inspiration. And Drew Brees helped change everything. He changed the climate. He changed the culture of the New Orleans Saints. And now they have become, some ways, a marquee NFL franchise. He's been a 4-time league leader in passing yards. He's had 4 seasons of over 5,000 passing yards, which is incredible. 3-time league leader in completion percentage, 4-time league leader in passing touchdowns. 2 of his 3 seasons that he led the league in completion percentage, he completed over 70% of his passes, which is a completely astounding statistic to me, knowing just how often Drew Brees has to throw the ball and how much of the burden he has taken on his shoulders over the past 8 years as the starting quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. I think it goes beyond saying that Drew Brees is the greatest New Orleans Saint of all time. He will be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And oh, by the way, he's taken the team to 2 NFC Championship games, 2006, 2009, won an NFC Championship in 2009, and beat Peyton Manning mano-a-mano in the Super Bowl for that 2009 season. So Drew Brees has done pretty much everything you could do in New Orleans, and to me, beyond question, is the greatest player in the history of the organization.